What's happening, dudes? My name is Grimdoc, and I'm here to tell you even more stuff about the ancient days of the Forgotten Realms. So in the last video, we left off talking about how the Sarrukh ended up turning to darker ways after leaving the Empire of Okoth behind during its era of finality. Anyways, some ended up splintering off from the Empire at the time and began worshipping one of the aspects of Ouroboros, the World Serpent. Last video, we talked about how he began fragmenting himself into separate gods and entities, and one of them happened to be a really good god called Jazirian. Jazirian would manifest himself as a gigantic rainbow-colored Kotal that flew around in the air and formed a circle with its tail in its mouth. Many of the Kotals would see Jazirian as both being hermaphroditic and sexless at the same time. So yeah, Jazirian was a little bit of everything, neither male or female. Now, Jazirian had his own idea to transform his new Sarrukh followers into a race of serpent folk at this time called the Kotals. And dude, the other Sarrukh didn't like that, so basically a war broke out between them. Alright, so Jazirian wasn't the most evil of Ouroboros' splinters, because a darker fragment of him called Mershulk ended up killing Jazirian later during this war. The Kotals basically lost their god, and after Jazirian died, the god Quotal ended up embracing them right away, and started calling them his divine minions. And a lot of the new species starting looking to Quotal as a reincarnation of Jazirian. Anyways, with the Sarrukh outnumbering them so heavily, they ended up losing the war at some point and fractured into multiple areas across the continent. Many of them ended up in the region of Chult and began worshipping Ubtao as their patron deity instead. And of course, Ubtao being the awesome good guy at the time, he took them in. So yeah, the Yuan Ti basically ended up taking over from then on. Now dudes, we're officially moving out of the Serpent Folk Empires, because this is the years when Mershulk began their decline. Now, the Yuan Ti ended up becoming the majority here, and another race began to take its place. This is when the Batrachi began their reign. And boy, do we need to talk about the Batrachi. Now, these guys originated in the oceans around this ancient time, and they eventually evolved to become amphibious, which means they ended up moving and living on the land as well as the ocean. Around this time when they did, they replaced the dinosauroids that existed on the land, and dude, they actually competed against the Yuan Ti in terms of building their empires up. Eventually, they ended up out-competing them too, making sure that the Yuan Ti's empires would never rise to the heights that the Sarrukh had reached thousands of years ago. So for the next 500 years, they'd live in relative peace for the most part, until a big war broke out between the Batrachi and another race that began showing up called the Jotun brood, which some called the Titans. These guys came in from the northern lands of Ouroboros a while ago, but didn't really begin anything big until around this time, when the leader of the Batrachi, called Zokudian, picked a fight with them. Hey dudes, so there were 4 major empires that the Batrachi ended up building for themselves. This included the realms of Kolafun, Boitamelo, Nadeza, and Zokudian. At the height of their empires, they would spread all across the supercontinent of Ouroboros. Anyways, back to the video. Alright dudes, we're moving a little bit fast again, but we certainly need to talk about the war against the Titans and the Batrachi. So at this time, there was a Batrachi civilization called Zokudian, and the ruler of this civilization was also called Zokudian. This guy was called the High One when he was the leader of the empire. Now, during Ouroboros' earlier days, we had other races that roamed and lived on the continent during the ages of the Sarrukh as well, and one of them was called the Titans. So a long time ago, there was a god from outside of realm space that created a new race of species called the Titans. This guy was called Lenaxus, and some referred to this guy as the Twilight Spirit. So there's a bit of convoluted information here, but long story short, Lenaxus was the son of Anam, who was another god that existed in another plane. Anyways, there was another goddess that was around during this time that ended up with Anam called Othea, and they had a baby called Lenaxus. Now, eventually, they would end up on Abertoral, and they would claim the cold, vast plains of the northern parts of the continent. They being Lenaxus and Othea, which was the mother of Lenaxus. Lenaxus ended up creating the Titans, and they would populate Meroboros' icy north. Later on, Zokurian, the High One, would end up trying to start a war against the Titans, which was a big mistake. Okay, so one of the Batrachi lords called Bazum Gorag would end up calling out King Zokurian for his gigantic mistake and called him a fool for causing the fall of the empire. And this war that he started would go on for 500 freaking years. Anyways, the High One Zokurian was eventually killed off by Omo the Titan in a random battle, who was basically a lord of one of the tribes, or a Thane of the Jotunbrud. And eventually, the Empire of Zokurian would fall to ruin. Okay dudes, this is when things went astronomically bad, like to a planetary degree, because the Batrachi decided to summon primordials to help them out. They were that desperate, and it didn't go the way they intended at all. They would end up making a gigantic summoning ritual that would end up unleashing a lot of the ancient primordials that were imprisoned during the Dawn War, and the gods immediately opposed this. Remember how earlier we covered Asgarath and how he was considered to be a splinter of the World Serpent, even though he was split into two dragons apparently? Well, around this time, he decided to do something absolutely extreme. But unfortunately guys, we're at the end of the video here dudes, so we'll definitely cover this cataclysmic event in the next video. Again, thank you all so much for watching this guys. It's getting a lot easier covering the lore, so we'll be progressing with more videos a little bit more frequently from here on. And if you guys found something that I missed out on the lore or got wrong, please call me out on it. I always enjoy a bit of criticism because it helps make the information correct. Anyways,